Hello and welcome to the Recruit Rockstars podcast, where we focus on the people part of your business. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting so that you can build a company filled with rock stars. And I've been really looking forward to today's episode with Luke Saunders. Luke is the CEO, the founder of Farmer's Fridge. And if you have been in Chicago in the past couple of years, you've seen Farmer's Fridge. You've probably tasted food out of a Farmer's Fridge machine. This is the first, I don't even know how you describe it. It's like an automated smart fridge. It's kind of like a vending machine, if you can imagine it. And Luke and his team are on a mission to make fresh, healthy food as accessible as a candy bar. And along the way, they've raised money from some of the top venture investors in the United States. The former McDonald's CEO, Don Thompson, the Manifesto Ventures group of Danone, and a whole bunch of others, including Eric Schmidt from Google. And this is just a super cool thing, but it really introduces some complex challenges when it comes to building the organization. And so Luke has agreed to come on the show and share some of the great things that he's learned along the way. So with that set up, how are you, Luke?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks so much for being on. We really appreciate it. Let's start at just the 30,000 foot level. Give people a sense of kind of how big the business is now in terms of people, how many fridges, whatever kind of metrics you're comfortable sharing.
Okay. Yeah, great. So to give you a sense, we're almost 300 employees now. We operate over 400 fridges between Milwaukee, Chicago, Indianapolis, New York City, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. And we're making tens of thousands of meals a day. And we do that all here in a central kitchen in Chicago, and then ship it out same day to the network of fridges across country.
And over time, do you envision opening more of these kitchens?
Yeah, we'll probably have 2 to 3 in the country as we scale. Right now, we can actually service most of the U.S. from our Chicago-based kitchen. It's one of the reasons why it's great to be in Chicago. But then to get to the West Coast, you really need another kitchen out there.
So you must be a guy that likes challenges, because this thing has hardware, software, logistics, food prep, data connectivity, payments. Is there anything I'm forgetting?
Probably. No, but I definitely, yeah, it is very true. We have a very complicated business. There's a lot of moving parts, and I don't know that I quite knew what I was getting myself into when I started.
Yeah.
But we definitely needed to mash together, food manufacturing, CPG, like direct to consumer, hardware, software. It's pretty much, we have a distribution company because we're actually delivering all the food ourselves.
Right. And then there's B2B sales, because you need to get the fridges placed into airports, hospitals, universities, office buildings, et cetera.
Exactly.
So you basically have covered every complex aspect of a business.
Yes. Most businesses, like if you figure out the sales model, you can scale it up. Or if you figure out, how do you market to a consumer and get product market fit? And, in our world, you've got to take all of those things and line them up and get them all to perform roughly equal at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's much more complicated to scale it for sure.
And that's why I was so excited to have you on the show, because I have to imagine that really creates some very interesting recruiting, retention, culture, leadership challenges. And that's what we're going to talk about the next, 15 minutes or so. When you think about these 300 folks, and, you've got everything from some of the smartest hardware and software developers to folks that prepare salads, right? So how do you build a culture that works across that entire spectrum? Oh, and PS does it in multiple locations, so kind of a distributed workforce.
Yeah, no, it's something that very early on I realized because we were operating out of a shared kitchen, and my first 2 employees were actually hourly production kitchen, and I was working right alongside them. And then we needed someone to do sales and marketing, and so I hired her. And immediately it was completely different. The needs of my production team and my sales team, they had completely different things they were interested in doing and ways they wanted to engage in the business and grow professionally. So it really was clear very early on that one of our biggest challenges was going to be creating a culture that held up across that. And I think what we've done is just be really intentional about the fact that our business doesn't work without every one of those parts.
Yep.
And so no individual person is above the whole, and no role is more important. So whether you're, cleaning the facility every night to make sure that nobody gets sick, or you're writing a line of code to make sure that the fridge shuts down if the temperature's out of range, like, you have the same level of importance. Like, none of us get to be here if we're all not pulling our weight. And so that being our ethos, you attract people that are like that. So I actually remember early on when we had we were having big discussions around, like, is this a tech company or a food company? And it's like, it doesn't matter. Like,
Yeah.
we like, if you're so worried about this being like, the engineers need to be worshipped and everyone else needs to get in line behind them, you're not a good fit for this company.
So that probably creates some recruiting challenges, because you and I both know there are certain functional areas where folks feel like they should come first or are first amongst equals. It sounds like humility and integration and collaboration are really at the center of what you do.
Yes, for sure. And humility actually is one of the stated core values. But when we created them, it's been one of the few that actually has really stayed on there the entire time. Because to that example, like, if you don't have the humility to recognize that we all have a role to play in this complicated business and none of it is more important than the other, then you just fundamentally can't be on the team.
Have you had to part ways with folks along the way who, didn't live that value?
Yeah, for sure. And I think for me, it's been really interesting because we've been through phases where when I first started the company, I knew of good culture, and I hadn't necessarily worked at a company that had great culture. But you'd hear about it. It was this aspirational thing. And I knew I wanted a company with good culture. And especially once I started having 2, 3, 4, 5 people that were on the team, you start thinking a lot about what's that going to be and how are we forming it. And so we actually went through a phase where we were writing down values and trying to explain every single one of them to every new person, and fighting over a word here and there. And probably the most transformational thing for the company was when we realized that, yes, it's important to sort of document things and be clear that humility is a core value, but what's going to matter more than anything is the behavior. So, like, if someone is walking, if you're saying humility is really important and somebody's walking around and they don't have a humble attitude and you let them stay on your team, then what you're saying is really not that important.
Yeah.
So
you're kind of making an important statement about how serious you are about the values of the company.
Yeah, and it's actually it's worse than having the values in the first place, because you're saying not only does this value not matter, but you're the kind of person who says one thing and does another.
Yeah.
And so most of the time, actually, when we've had to transition with someone, is like it's a lot of times it's not even performance based. These are great people, but they don't fit. They don't value the same things we value, and that's really bad for the organization. So yes, we've definitely made those changes.
How do you make those changes when someone is doing great, their performance is great, their numbers are great, or their productivity in writing software is great, but they're kind of destroying and shitting on the values? How do you make that tough call? It sounds easy in hindsight, but I'm sure it's not that easy.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. I think in general, they're usually really unhappy, and so is the rest of the team. So I find most of the time those are actually the easiest ones, because the values are misaligned, and so people are not happy. And so you sit down, you say, like, you don't seem very happy, and they're like, I'm not. Well, like, then let's make this a graceful transition where you can have some time to go look for something else to do, and we'll be really intentional. This isn't meant to be like a tomorrow you're fired kind of experience. but you're unhappy, you're making your colleagues unhappy, this isn't a good environment. And it's actually the easiest ones. I think the harder ones are when we have people that deeply care and have all the right values but aren't performing.
Yeah, those are much
And
tougher decisions.
much harder.
Yeah.
So that's actually where it's like we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do we set those people up for success and reset the system. Maybe they weren't set up for performance at the beginning, but I find those are way harder because
So
those people actually want to be here.
yeah, it sounds like you spend a lot of time assessing candidates for DNA and for fit. How do you do that, Luke? What have you learned that you can share about how to assess candidates to match Farmer's Fridge, very unique culture?
I think, not to plug your book, but one of the things we did do was read your book, and I think it simplified it in a really nice way where you're like, oh, we can actually ask questions that get to whether or not this person is this type of person from a value standpoint, or the core DNA. So we definitely started integrating that into our interview process.
Yep.
And I think early on, what really resonated with me and even just how we got to know each other was, we kind of did like everyone else. We had a low success rate. So, we would hire people and it just wouldn't work out. And then as you're hiring more and more people, you obviously want that to get better. And so we got much more intentional about asking the right questions, really digging in on that. And what we would do is we would take people on the team that we felt were the most representative in terms of how they operated within the company. So they were collaborative across all the different groups. They worked really hard and tried for excellence, perfection in their work. They were humble. It was like the people who embodied this ended up being part of the screening process as well. And they're usually not on the hiring team. And so there's a double benefit, which is one, they tend to be able to identify this or notice when people are not being genuine in the interview.
Yep.
But then they also don't have the pressure of trying to backfill a role where, they can sort of look at it more objectively. So that was probably the most game-changing thing we did, is just introduce people that were not actually part of the hiring team that represented everything that we wanted in our candidates.
It's kind of like Amazon has this concept of bar raisers, where there are people that are outside the hiring team, but their sole focus is on interviewing and assessing candidates to make sure they continually raise the bar on the quality of people.
Yeah, it's just like any process in a company where interest isn't totally aligned. A lot of times, like the hiring team just wants to fill a role and get the job done. And you need a safety valve on that to make sure that the people that they're bringing in are going to scale with the company.
For listeners that are skeptical on this, Luke, and I know it's hard to put numbers on it, but what kind of impact do you think it makes if you think about before you figured this stuff out, fast forward to today? I don't know if you think about it in terms of retention rate or turnover. I don't know how you measure it, but just can you give some sense of the impact it makes on the business?
Yeah, I mean, I would say easily early on. So keep in mind, I had never really been responsible for hiring large numbers of people. In my previous two companies, I had one part-time employee in the first one, and I had 2.5, 3 full-time employees in the second one. And so it wasn't like a core competency of mine. All of a sudden, Farmer's Fridge were now 300 people, and you don't get there overnight. And so at the beginning, when I was hiring people, I mean, we were lucky if we were getting it right 50% of the time. And that might be generous.
Yeah.
And it was
which I know sounds bad, but that's kind of the average. So that you were doing about the same as everybody else.
Yeah, and we were constantly iterating it. Like, we said, well, this person, maybe they could do great work, but man, we couldn't stand working with them, and they couldn't stand working with us. So maybe we should like all go out and get a coffee before we make an offer, and then try that, and that doesn't work. And so there's a lot of like trial and error to try to improve it. And ultimately, what really changed the game was a woman that I hired, Shayna Harris, came in and said, look, let's build a process around this. And like, here, we're going to evaluate at each step. We're going to score them. We're going to this is how different people will interview them. This is what, we'll line on the scorecard up front. Like, just some of the basics, and it probably improved from 50% to 80%.
Mm.
And then as we got to 80%, that's actually still really disruptive to a company that's growing as quickly as we're growing, and needs really high caliber people. So we just kept refining that. And I think that the biggest change was getting the DNA pieces right, and then having this fail safes on the process. So we do a case now with every interview.
Yeah.
And we have people outside the hiring org interview for the DNA, and we have really clearly, very, very clearly defined scorecards against like competencies of DNA up front.
And I'll bet you don't lose a lot of candidates when you invest all that time. Candidates know that you're serious. They probably really respect that you put talent and hiring first. You probably don't lose a lot of good candidates.
No, honestly, like that's one of the most surprising things to me is the amount of time people are willing to commit.
Yep.
And the positive feedback we get on that after the interview, because they feel like, what to your point, that you care, but they also, that's how they get to know you. So
yeah, right.
it gives them a chance to understand, like, where is the organization really at? Where is this team at? What is this role really going to be like? Who am I going to be working with? And I find that is just as good of a screening method as anything else. I remember, like, it's a scaled up version of this, but when we were first getting started, we were interviewing someone for an internship.
Yeah.
And she came in and she was really great. And I thought, well, you seem great. Honestly, don't have a process, so this is mostly on gut feel. But her parents were outside in the car, and so I was like, why don't you bring them in here? We'll show them around. And we were in the shared kitchen. It was totally dingy and like not an office environment like most parents would see their kid graduating college and getting a job at.
Yep.
And they came in and they thought it was perfect for her. And I'm like, well, who knows? Nobody knows you better than your parents at this point. So like, you're hired. But like just kind of creating an environment where it's self-selecting is, I think, another really big trick to this. So like our office is in a neighborhood where, you know, it's not in the middle of the loop downtown. It's in a place where it's pretty intentional and people want it to be here.
Yep. So when you say self-select, you really mean, just like you position or differentiate a product, you've really positioned and differentiated the culture, and you've made a statement as to what we will and won't tolerate, what we stand for. And if people opt in, that's great, and they're probably a great fit. And if they opt out, that's fine too.
Yep. Yeah. And I think just the last layer that we do is, before we hire, even during the offer stage, we're really candid with people about, you know, the role and the environment that they're entering into and those kinds of things. So they can't say after the fact, well, like, oh, I didn't know it was going to be ambiguous. And
yeah.
It's like, if this is a startup, I'll never forget when we hired like the first person into a startup, and they're like, you know, the things are changing all the time and none of the systems are built. And, you know, we're like, yeah, that was like, that's what we hired you to do.
Yeah. You didn't tell me that.
So we stopped making that mistake.
Great. Well, Luke, I give you a ton of credit. You know, as you admitted, you didn't have a ton of experience doing this, yet you and your team have created one of Chicago's fastest growing tech companies, food companies, success stories. I give you a ton of credit. Congratulations. I know there's a lot to follow, but hopefully you smell the roses along the way.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. And I do think people by far has been, the most exciting part of the journey, is building a great team and seeing who comes together to support what 6 years ago was just an idea is really what gives me the energy every day to keep going.
How can people learn more about Farmer's Fridge or get in touch?
They can visit our website, farmersfridge.com. We're also on, you know, LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram. And if you see a fridge, download the app and get 50% off your first purchase.
And it is yummy, yummy stuff, I got to tell you.
Yes, definitely. Food quality is like number one. People have to like the food.
Thanks so much for making the time, Luke. We appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, Jeff.